Welcome to Market News International's July webinar, The Coming Fiscal Showdown. I'm Lauren Hand, I'm the Marketing Manager for MNI, and today I will give you a brief overview of what we do here at MNI. John Shaw, our featured reporter, will speak for about 50 minutes on deficit reduction and the debt limit, and follow with a question and answer session. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, you can get into the Q&A or chat boxes on the right-hand side of the screen. When you chat, you can now address all questions to me by using the drop-down menu or all panelists. We'll try to get to all of your questions, time permitting. You can also email John with questions after the webinar or email me for a recording of this webinar or for the slides used in today's presentation, and have our contact information available at the end of this webinar. Market News International, we are a subsidiary of the Deutsche Börse Group and a leading provider of news and analysis specifically for the global foreign exchange and fixed income markets. We're four real-time English language financial news agencies with credentials recognized by governments and central banks of all major economies. We have exclusive monetary and fiscal policy reports, economic indicators and forecasts, market-moving interviews with key central bank and finance ministry officials, government policymakers, economists. Our 60 full-time journalists are located in 12 news bureaus across Europe, America, and Asia, many of which are former fixed income and currency traders and strategists who know the markets and combine their economics expertise with meticulous financial journalism. Today's featured reporter is Mr. John Shaw. Mr. John Shaw has been MNI's congressional correspondent since 1991, reporting on fiscal policy, trade, pensions, banking, China relations, and many other issues. He has a undergraduate degree in political science from Knox College and a master's in history from the University of New South Wales, where he attended as a Rotary Graduate Fellow. John provides regular updates on Congress for the C-SPAN cable TV networks, the PBS News Hour with Jim Lehrer, and KPCC and NPR affiliate in Los Angeles. And today's webinar, John will focus on the looming showdown on Capitol Hill on U.S. fiscal policy, as Congress attempts to come up with a 10-year deficit reduction package of at least $2 trillion and increase the debt ceiling, all by August 2nd of this year. We'll give an update on the status of budget negotiations between the White House and Congress. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to John.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for putting us together, and thank everyone for listening in. What I'd like to do in the next couple minutes is just provide first a kind of a broad context for the talks that are going on right now. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the various options that appear to be on the table in terms of resolving the debt limit crisis. And then finally, then I'd like to actually, within that context, give some sense of how I think this crisis is likely to be resolved. I'd like to talk for a couple minutes about what sort of an agreement is likely to come forth, and also just some sense of how it would be best to evaluate that agreement. I'd like to talk for a moment about the consequences of this fight, and then finally the sort of huge issue of when we're ever going to solve this fiscal problem. And to begin, I'm going to make this sort of disclaimer that you expect me to make, which is this is a remarkably fast-moving and fluid story. Things are changing literally by the hour. In fact, in about an hour, the president is going to be meeting with the Speaker of the House and the House Majority Leader, which will shift the story in a slightly different direction. So it's very fast-moving. I'm going to try to give you some sense of where I think this is going, but events are very, very hard to track right now. In terms of just the context, what I'd like to just maybe start out with is just a word or two in kind of a historical sense. And as I look at this debt ceiling fight, it seems to me almost the perfect culmination of a decade-long battle over fiscal policy. To me, this sort of era began in January of 2001 when Alan Greenspan testified before the Senate Budget Committee and expressed in serious terms his concern that the U.S. was poised to pay off its debt too quickly. Now, fast forward 10 years, and Congress is likely to increase the debt ceiling to over $16 trillion. There's been a decade of almost of fiscal policies that have not been particularly sound. I mean, we've had deep tax cuts that haven't been paid for, new entitlement programs, we've had stimulus bills, we've had all assortment of, we've had two wars that haven't really been paid for. So the fiscal situation, as everyone who knows, who follows these things knows, is very, very, very grim. In fact, I mean, the one sort of historical reference I sometimes think about is when the decade began, there was a lot of talk about the United States as sort of the new Roman Empire. And as this decade comes to a conclusion, there's a lot more discussion about the U.S. as sort of a modern-day Greece. So it's been a remarkable shift of economic and fiscal fortunes, and that's sort of the context for this debt ceiling battle. In terms of the more immediate context, I think you have to view the debt ceiling fight as sort of a consequence of the Republican victory in the midterm elections. The Republicans did well in the Senate. They did not actually capture control of it. They did capture control of the House. And when they came to power in January of 2011, one of the things they said was that they were going to use the debt ceiling as an instrument to try to advance their fiscal agenda. The leader, the House Speaker John Boehner, and the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell were pretty careful to say that they felt that Congress did have to pass the debt ceiling. They did not see that as optional, which some Republicans do, but also said that it was not going to pass without some sort of stringent conditions. And as the months unfolded, the Speaker, Mr. Boehner, actually put out a formula, which he first unveiled, I think, at a speech in New York. And he said that basically the debt ceiling would be increased by the amount of spending cuts that were passed. And with everyone looking at a debt ceiling increase of about $2.4 trillion to get past the 2012 elections, he was saying that there needed to be a deficit-cutting package of about $2.4 trillion. So that is sort of one of the main context for Showdown. Now, as the months have unfolded, we've had a couple of rounds of budget talks. Vice President Biden presided over talks both at the Blair House and in the Capitol for about 6 or 7 weeks. He had a kind of a strange group negotiating with him. It was sort of the B team. It was, sort of second-tier leadership, people who are not particularly likely to craft the final agreement, but they were some heavy hitters. So but they also were not really budget experts. So they met for 6 or 7 weeks primarily in the Capitol. And as the talks unfolded, it seemed like they were focusing on a package of about $2 trillion in savings. About half of that $1 trillion would come from discretionary programs, and about the other half would come from entitlement programs. But in the end, before the deal finally came together, there was the inevitable discussion about whether revenues would be part of this package. The Democrats and the Vice President wanted very much for that to be the case. Republicans said no, and then Cantor pulled out of the talks on the basis of what he said was an impasse on the tax cut issue. The talks then shifted to the White House, where President Obama presided over them. He had a number of meetings, 6 or 7 meetings at least, with the senior congressional leaders. Sort of an illustration that sometimes direct negotiations are not the best thing for reaching an agreement. The discussions were extremely acrimonious. Mr. Cantor, the House Majority Leader, was extremely combative by all reports. Continued to say taxes couldn't be part of the equation. And those talks have been suspended, although I think they're very likely to resume in the next day or two. As I mentioned, the President will be meeting with Cantor and Boehner this evening to begin some dialogue, or to resume, really, some dialogue on this matter. So let me now kind of shift to the second area that I wanted to talk about, which was just, what are the sort of likely packages that could emerge from this debt ceiling increase, this debt ceiling impasse. As I'm sure you all know, the Treasury Secretary continues to say the debt ceiling needs to be hiked by August 2nd. And it seems like there are three or four options on the table. In fact, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney, in a press conference just a couple hours ago, when asked to say what are the options, he said, well, we can go big, we can go medium, or we can have a sort of fail-safe plan. By big, I think he meant the grand compromise, which has been talked about for some time. It's something that the President and the Speaker apparently explored, at least conceptually, that would involve about a $4 trillion deficit reduction package over a decade. It's in line with the package that was developed by the Simpson-Bowles Commission late last year. Critically, it would have deep spending cuts. I mean, it would be about a 3-to-1 ratio between spending cuts and revenues, but it would also include substantial revenues, up to about $1 trillion. These talks were ongoing, and then in the end, Mr. Boehner, largely from pressure from his, or anticipated pressure from his Republican caucus in the House, decided that he couldn't go that route. He then shifted to talks that were more along the lines of about a $2.4 trillion spending, $2.4 trillion debt limit increase, which would get everyone past the election. Those talks went on for some time, but again, at this point, the Republicans were pushing very hard that all of the deficit reductions come just from spending cuts, and Obama and Biden and the congressional Democrats said that there's no way that they were going to support a plan that just cut spending by $2.4 trillion, didn't have any additional revenues. The third option, which is being called sort of the fail-safe option, or some even are calling it Plan B, sort of put on the table last week by Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader. It's an extremely complex plan, which would effectively have the debt ceiling increase by $2.4 trillion about in 3 increments. The White House would have to offer post-spending cuts, but it would not actually have to see that they're enacted into law. It also involves several votes, which Republicans would be able to disapprove of the spending increase, but the process was structured in such a way that I could veto that. So it was unabashedly a political option to effectively shift all of the political heat on the debt ceiling on the president. In fact, I read one account in one of the congressional magazines which called it both politically shrewd and jaw-droppingly cynical. And the point I'm making is that it was shrewd in terms of making the Democrats have to keep voting on the debt ceiling increase, but it was cynical in the sense that the Republicans were really dropping any real notion of getting spending cuts as part of this package. Now, it seems to be evolving even further because this plan that McConnell has floated has been is revised really as we speak. He is now in direct negotiations with the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and I think in formal negotiations with the House Speaker, trying to find some way that they can revise this package so that it actually can pass both the Senate next week and the House next week. And the revisions they're talking about would be including specific spending cuts, and I've seen numbers as high as $1.5 trillion, and also possibly creating some kind of special process in which a larger deficit reduction package might be able to be negotiated. My own sense is that what we're likely to see next week is, or even this weekend, is an announcement by the President and the congressional leadership that they support some variation of the McConnell plan. I think for this to go forward, you're going to need total buy-in, or at least public buy-in, by the President, the Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader, and the House Minority Leader. So I think one of the things that I'm looking at in the next 5 or 6 days is some public announcement by all of these folks that they will support this plan. But again, the situation is very fluid. As I'm sure you've heard, there was a new kind of budget idea that entered the debate just yesterday, in which the so-called Gang of Six, a group of 6 senators, have offered their plan. It's a sort of a $4 trillion deficit reduction plan. I think it may be part of the debate going forward. I don't think it's going to be directly tied to the debt limit. I think maybe some pieces of it might be plastered onto the McConnell package, but I don't think that as a standalone measure is going to go very far, in part just because the timing issue. It would take literally weeks to get it both legislative language and also scored by the Congressional Budget Office. For just a minute or two about just how to evaluate an agreement. I think I have that in one of my slides, and I noted that there's a paper by a group called the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Actually, they released the paper on June 21st rather than July 21st, and they outlined just what the elements of a serious deficit reduction plan would be. They said it would be between $4 and $5 trillion over a decade. It would include specific and tangible entitlement reforms and wouldn't draw heavily on discretionary savings. I think most of the budget options that we have seen introduced so far do not meet that standard by a long shot. There are some plans that have $4 to $5 trillion in deficit reduction, including this so-called Gang of Six. But even the Gang of Six makes relatively few specific changes. They call on some key congressional committees to actually draft the package so that they have these entitlement reforms. And almost all of the ideas circulating on Capitol Hill draw very heavily from discretionary spending, which is about 1/3 of the budget. And most budget experts will say that's not where the problem is. The problem is these entitlement programs that are just growing steadily, and that by relying heavily on unspecified discretionary savings, it's effectively an effort to sort of punt and not really deal with the nation's fiscal problems. I'd like to talk for a couple seconds on just the slide that I described as how does this end. And here trying to get at is just some of the kind of political consequences of this whole debt ceiling battle. And I think one of them is that the president has moved very significantly to the center of the political space. Now, there are a lot of people who think it's who doubt his sincerity. Some believe it's very calculated, but he certainly has positioned himself as someone who's repeatedly calling for a consequential $4 trillion deficit reduction package. He said he's willing to take the heat and include reforms to Social Security and Medicare. And it looks to me somewhat similar to what President Clinton was able to do during his budget fights in the 90s, in which he battled the Republicans and was able to kind of position himself to the center and actually allowed him to get reelected in that way. Now, I think Obama's situation is complicated enormously by just the pace of the economic recovery, but I think it's very interesting how he has maneuvered himself sharply to the center during those last month or so. Also striking in this political consequences of this debate is that the Republican Party has been driving the agenda, but there's also some real clear signs of fissions and fractures in their party. The personal battle really between the Speaker, John Boehner, and his number two person, the House Majority Leader, is evident. Eric Cantor is evident for everyone to observe. It's almost assumed that at some point Cantor is going to make a bid for Boehner's job, which has made hard for Boehner to maneuver very much and effectively prevented him from cutting any kind of budget deal with President Obama. And also there's something that I have to say I never really factored in as this year started, which was just a fairly sizable group of Republicans who are just of the non-compromising variety. I mean, they want 100%, and they were not willing to support any kind of budget agreement that gives them less than this. And there have been a number of articles. I mean, David Brooks in the New York Times has written a number of pieces saying the Republicans have basically been handed the fiscal package of their dreams, and they're turning it down because it would require some additional revenues. And so there's a lot of sense that there's at least someone like a Boehner would be willing, and McConnell probably would be willing to make an agreement. There's a lot of pressure among some of the people in their caucuses not to go forward. Well, let me kind of end with the final slide in which I describe, how do we finally solve this problem? And here I'm wondering what has been gained by this debt limit debate. And it's not, I would argue, a pretty picture. I think that it has focused attention on fiscal issues, but not in the way that you would hope. I mean, there hasn't been this broad debate about how the U.S. was able to, how the U.S.'s fiscal position has deteriorated so sharply. There's been a lot of tactical maneuvering, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of strict adherence to talking points. And there really hasn't been the broad debate about where American fiscal policy has gone wrong and how to fix it. But despite that, I think there's the one positive that has emerged, at least coincident with this debate, has been a number of plans, including the SimpsonBowles plan, the so-called Gang of Six plan that provide at least a template for how the U.S. might be able to begin getting out of its fiscal predicament. Every one of these plans talks about a $4 trillion in savings over a decade, with some balance between spending cuts and revenues. So that is out there, and the question that everyone has to ask and no one can answer is when and if the political system will stabilize enough that Republicans and Democrats will be able to sit down and reach a broad agreement. People have said for a long time that they did not think that was going to occur until after the 2012 presidential and congressional elections. That may be the case, but I know analysts fear that the elections are going to have each side sort of dig in deeper and not really provide the foundation for a budget agreement. So it will be very interesting to see how these next 2 weeks really unfold. But to repeat, I think that there's likely to be a bipartisan agreement to increase the debt limit by a certain amount. I mean, I don't know if it's going to be a 6-month deal or a year deal. There'll be some spending cuts that will be attached to it, and there also will be some kind of special process which broader deficit reduction initiatives are considered by Congress. So with that, I will just stop and take any questions that might be on the minds of our listeners.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I received a number of questions. Here's one from Carly. If McConnell's plan is still likely to include increases in the debt ceiling in tranches of $700 billion, $900 billion, and $100 billion, when is likely to be necessary, and what further turmoil might be likely at the next round when the next tranche is necessary? What more than just a repeat of the current shenanigans grandstanding for the 2012 election?
Well, I think one of the weaknesses of the McConnell plan is it really, it's just an exercise in kicking the ball down or kicking the can down the road in 3 different increments. And I do think that, in fact, that's McConnell's idea, is to continue to make this a politically difficult exercise for the administration. So it will have to make 3 separate requests. There would be a vote to disapprove the debt limit. So there would be a whole series of political fights that this process even creates. What it would do is effectively allow the president to get out of this current box and increase the debt ceiling. So I think that, and I might make one cautionary note that the McConnell plan, to me, still is a piece of legislative work that is evolving. It seems like it's the template for what is being discussed, but is in no way final, and it is likely to change significantly, I think, in the next week or so.
Okay, and Lisa asks, has a lawmaker raised the charitable deduction when talking about increasing taxes, Republican or Democrat?
I think I don't know that anyone has it's one of those that is on the menu of possible steps to be taken. I don't know that anyone right now has embraced it in a specific way. I think much of the discussion on finding savings has been broader than that, rather than that specific provisions, but has actually focused on just reaching targets such as $1 billion from discretionary programs or $300 billion from non-healthcare entitlements. So to answer the question more directly, that has been mentioned. You hear it mentioned periodically, but has not yet certainly been identified as an item that will be in the package.
And this question comes from Tom. Given the fact that the U.S. dollar is a reverse currency and will continue to be so, does that take the pressure off the U.S. to reduce the deficit and balance their budget?
Well, I think that there's still significant pressure. I mean, there's obviously, we've heard threats of downgrades from the various rating agencies, and even just within the federal budget, the category of debt service expenses is set to grow to really almost staggering numbers. In fact, in a couple of years, it will be the second or third largest expenditure in terms of categories in the federal budget. So I think the broad bipartisan sense that the U.S.'s fiscal situation has deteriorated sharply and needs to be reversed, and that by implementing relatively moderate changes now, the U.S. will be able to get on a much sounder fiscal path. So I think that is driving the debate on Capitol Hill more so than just the value of the dollar.
Okay, this question comes from Luke. How are the freshman Republicans this time around different in terms of their fiscal outlook from the recently elected ones during Clinton's budget battles?
I think they are far more uncompromising. They are less, and I'll put this as tactfully as I can, less focused on evidence. I mean, I think they're just much more ideological, and I think that the debt ceiling is a perfect example in which there have been a number of very credible, reputable, nonpartisan reports saying that not increasing the debt ceiling would have serious consequences, and yet there are a number who say, I just don't care. I think it's more important to make a point, demand, whatever their demands are. So this is, and I think that's the one variable that everyone is trying to struggle with, because the so-called Tea Party wing of the Republican Party is not a compromising group, and I think the leadership, as they put together a final package, almost has to assume that none of them will vote for the debt ceiling increase regardless of what the package is. So that's going to involve a very delicate political situation in which both Democrats and Republicans are going to be needed to pass the debt ceiling. So it's going to be a very interesting and complicated political coalition, which makes the substance of the agreement also very complicated.
Okay, and I believe we have one more question from James. There has been a lot of talk about a new Homeland Investment Act that would allow U.S. multinational companies to repatriate profits at lower tax rates. What do you think about the chances of A2 being part of any tax package?
I think it's very unlikely, in part because, this debate, at least as it's being framed by many, includes very, very deep cuts in programs that are dear, certainly to Democrats. But when you're talking about, scaling back significantly Medicaid, Medicare, possibly altering Social Security benefits, to couple that with a package which is at least perceived as an additional deep tax cut for businesses, is not something that would be politically acceptable. I think that separately, that the administration has said very clearly that they oppose these provisions unless it's part of a comprehensive tax reform. So it could be that there's some talk about stimulus in another package later in the year, but certainly in terms of the debt ceiling increase, I would be stunned if that were part of the package.
Great, that's it. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Lauren. I really appreciate it.
MN's webinar, Policy Changes in Latin America, will be led by our Deputy Bureau Chief for International News, Heather Scott, and it will take place on Tuesday, August 30th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. This webinar will focus on how the major Latin American economies are trying to deal with the currency appreciation and inflation pressures that come with the massive capital flows from foreign investors. When you webinar session today, you'll be immediately directed to the registration page, or you can always register a leader by visiting marketnews.webex.com. And as promised, here are email addresses and our phone numbers if you'd like to contact us. You can contact John with any questions regarding the content of today's presentation, and you can contact me for a recording of today's webinar or a copy of the slides used today. And you can follow us on Twitter at MNI News, and we're on Facebook and LinkedIn at Market News International. Thank you much for attending today.